Dear reality TV lover, Brittany and Jack's Beyond the Breakup, Part 2. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT and OCD specialist, family systems coach, integrative mental health practitioner, and your host for Reality Case Studies. If you joined me for Part 1, we explored how emotionally unhealthy relationships rarely begin looking unhealthy. We examined love bombing, attachment theory, protective factors, Bowen Family Systems Theory, intermittent reinforcement, objectification, and the gradual psychological processes that can make it extraordinarily difficult to recognize unhealthy dynamics while living inside them. Today we move into the next chapter of the story. Leaving a relationship and healing from a relationship are not the same psychological experience. One is an event. The other is a biological, neurological, and emotional process that often unfolds over months and years. We'll explore why the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, how chronic stress changes the nervous system, why co-parenting can keep the stress response activated, and how concepts such as trauma bonding, gaslighting, projection, DARVO, and differentiation of self help us understand why recovery is so much more than simply moving on. As always, this is a psychological case study, not a diagnosis. I have never evaluated the individuals discussed in this episode. We are examining publicly observable patterns through established psychological theories and then turning those lessons back toward our own lives. My hope is that by understanding someone else's story, you begin to better understand your own story, your loved one's story, or the story of someone else in your life. Let's continue. The body keeps the score. Why healing is more than leaving the relationship. One of the conversations that has fascinated me since Brittany publicly shared her mommy makeover has had very little to do with psychology and almost everything to do with public opinion. I have read countless comments questioning why she chose surgery, suggesting that she looks exactly the same, or criticizing her body altogether. As a therapist, I find myself thinking that we are asking the wrong question. The question is not whether strangers on the internet believe her body changed enough to justify surgery. The question is whether we have any appreciation for what her nervous system may have been carrying for more than a decade. Before we comment on someone's body, perhaps we should first ask ourselves what that body has survived. One of the books I recommend more than almost any other is The Body Keeps the Score by psychiatrist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. The title itself captures one of the most profound discoveries in modern neuroscience. Difficult experiences do not simply become memories stored somewhere inside the brain. They become biological experiences. Our nervous system remembers. Our endocrine system remembers. Our immune system remembers. Our cardiovascular system remembers. Our muscles remember. Our sleep remembers. Our appetite remembers. Psychology is not separate from the body. The body is one of the primary places where psychology is expressed. To understand why this happens, we have to travel back hundreds of thousands of years. The human brain evolved long before modern homes, attorneys, co-parenting apps, smartphones, text messages, reality television, or social media existed. Our ancestors lived in environments where danger was immediate, physical, and often life-threatening. Imagine walking through the wilderness 100,000 years ago when suddenly a saber-toothed tiger emerged from behind the trees. Your brain did not pause to analyze the situation. It did not wonder whether the tiger was having a bad day or whether better communication might solve the problem. Within milliseconds, your amygdala, one of the brain's primary threat detection centers, recognized danger. Your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, commonly referred to as the HPA axis, immediately activated. Adrenaline surged through your bloodstream, cortisol was released, your heart began beating faster. Blood was redirected away from digestion and toward your large muscle groups. Your breathing became quicker. Your pupils dilated. Every biological system reorganized itself around one singular objective: survival. The individuals whose brains rapidly detected danger were more likely to survive long enough to pass their genes to future generations. We carry that same remarkably sophisticated survival system inside our bodies today. The challenge is that while our world has changed dramatically, our nervous systems have not evolved nearly as quickly. The same biological machinery that once protected us from predators now responds to many forms of emotional danger in remarkably similar ways. The amygdala does not distinguish as neatly between a saber-toothed tiger and a chronically unpredictable relationship as most people assume. It responds to betrayal. It responds to humiliation. It responds to repeated criticism. It responds to emotional unpredictability. It responds to chronic conflict. It responds to financial instability. It responds to repeated experiences in which the nervous system concludes that the environment is uncertain or emotionally unsafe. The amygdala is not asking, "Is this a tiger?" It is asking a much simpler and much more primitive question. Am I safe? When the answer repeatedly becomes, "I'm not sure," the nervous system often continues preparing for danger. This is why chronic relational stress becomes so biologically exhausting. Unlike a saber-toothed tiger, which eventually disappears, emotionally difficult relationships often do not end with one clear moment of safety. There is no single point at which the nervous system receives the message that the emergency has completely passed. Instead, the stress response may become activated over and over again through hundreds or even thousands of seemingly ordinary interactions. A difficult conversation, an unexpected phone call, a painful memory, financial conflict, public scrutiny, a legal issue, another disappointment, another broken promise, another argument, another period of uncertainty. Each experience may appear relatively small when viewed independently. Collectively, however, they teach the nervous system that it must remain prepared. This is one of the reasons I hope people will pause before commenting on Brittany's body. None of us lives inside her nervous system. None of us can know exactly how her body has responded to the past 11 years, because none of us has experienced what she has experienced. What we do know from decades of neuroscience, psychoneuroendocrinology, and trauma research is that chronic stress changes biology. It changes sleep, it changes appetite regulation, it changes insulin sensitivity, it influences inflammation, it alters immune functioning, it affects emotional regulation, it influences energy levels, it can affect where and how some individuals store body fat. None of these outcomes occur in every person, and body weight is influenced by genetics, hormones, pregnancy, medications, nutrition, physical activity, menopause, and countless other variables. The point is not that stress explains everything. The point is that chronic stress affects far more than most people can begin to appreciate. There is another aspect of Brittany's story that I believe is equally important. Many people speak as though once she separated from Jax, the stress simply ended. Psychologically, that is often not how separation works when children are involved. Divorce may end the marriage, but it does not necessarily end the relationship. Parents who share a child frequently remain connected through custody schedules, medical decisions, school conferences, birthdays, holidays, extracurricular activities, financial obligations, legal matters, and countless ordinary interactions that continue for years and sometimes decades. Every text message, every exchange, every unexpected phone call has the potential to remind the nervous system of previous experiences. The public sees only a tiny fraction of those interactions. The cameras capture moments. They do not capture daily life. So before someone casually asks, "Why hasn't she lost the weight?" or comments that she should simply move on, I think we need to ask a much more psychologically sophisticated question. What has her nervous system been adapting to for the past 11 years? Researchers use the term allostatic load to describe the cumulative wear and tear that develops when the body's stress response systems remain activated over prolonged periods of time. The body is remarkably resilient. It can adapt to tremendous amounts of stress. The problem is that adaptation comes with physiological costs. When cortisol remains elevated for extended periods, when sleep becomes fragmented, when the nervous system spends years anticipating the next emotional disruption, the body begins allocating resources toward survival rather than restoration. The nervous system is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is protecting the individual as best it can based upon the information it has received through repeated experience. This is why I become uncomfortable when conversations reduce someone's body to willpower, discipline, or appearance alone. Bodies are biographies. Bodies tell stories. Sometimes those stories include pregnancy. Sometimes they include postpartum recovery. Sometimes they include menopause. Sometimes they include autoimmune disease. Sometimes they include grief. Sometimes they include years of interrupted sleep. Sometimes they include caregiving. Sometimes they include chronic relational stress that the outside world never fully sees. We simply cannot understand someone's physiology if we ignore their psychology. As therapists, one of our first goals after someone leaves a chronically stressful relationship is not simply helping them think differently, it is helping their nervous system experience safety again. Healing is physiological as much as it is psychological. We begin helping the body learn that it no longer has to prepare for the next emotional emergency. That process occurs through many small, repeated experiences. Restorative sleep helps normalize cortisol rhythms. Walking, resistance training, yoga, and other enjoyable forms of movement help regulate the stress response. Slow diaphragmatic breathing and extended exhalations activate the parasympathetic nervous system, communicating safety to the body. Spending time in nature lowers physiological arousal for many people. Safe, emotionally supportive relationships increase oxytocin and buffer the effects of chronic stress. Consistent daily routines reduce uncertainty. Mindfulness practices strengthen the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotional reactivity. Trauma-informed psychotherapy helps the brain reorganize old threat predictions so that reminders of the past no longer trigger the same level of physiological activation. Perhaps most importantly, healing occurs through predictability. The nervous system heals in environments where it no longer has to wonder what version of another person it will encounter today. It heals when honesty replaces uncertainty, when consistency replaces chaos, when accountability replaces unpredictability, when the brain gradually learns, through thousands of ordinary moments, that it no longer has to prepare for battle every morning when it wakes up. That is what healing actually looks like from a neuroscientific perspective. It is not simply forgetting the past. It is helping the brain and body discover that the emergency is over. So when I hear conversations reducing Brittany's story to how her body looks, I cannot help but think those conversations are missing the most important part of the story. They are looking at the outside while ignoring everything happening beneath the surface. As therapists, we are trained to ask different questions. We ask not simply, "What do I see?" We ask, "What invisible burden might this nervous system have been carrying all along?" Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is remember that before we judge someone's body, we should first consider the story that body may have spent years surviving. As we continue examining this relationship, another psychological question naturally emerges. If criticism, objectification, and conditional approval gradually become part of the emotional climate, why do many individuals continue hoping that the relationship can return to what it once was? To answer that question, we must explore one of the most misunderstood concepts in relationship psychology: trauma bonding, intermittent reinforcement, and the remarkable capacity of hope to keep people emotionally invested even after repeated disappointment. Trauma bonds, intermittent reinforcement, and why leaving is far more complicated than people imagine. One of the questions therapists hear more than almost any other when discussing emotionally unhealthy relationships is remarkably simple. Why didn't they just leave? It is a question often asked by friends, family members, viewers, and even individuals looking back on their own relationships years later. On the surface, it appears logical. If someone is repeatedly lied to, criticized, humiliated, betrayed, manipulated, or emotionally hurt, why would they remain? Why would they continue believing promises that had already been broken? Why would they continue hoping after so many disappointments? These questions are understandable, yet they also reveal how differently relationships appear from the outside than they feel from the inside. Psychology asks us to suspend judgment long enough to understand the processes that make leaving extraordinarily difficult. The answer is rarely a lack of intelligence, a lack of strength, or a lack of self-respect. More often, it reflects the complex interaction between attachment, neurobiology, learning, hope, grief, identity, and the human nervous system's remarkable capacity to adapt to almost any emotional environment. One concept frequently discussed in this context is the idea of a trauma bond. It is important to define this term carefully because it is often misunderstood and frequently misused online. A trauma bond does not refer to two people who experience trauma together, nor does it simply describe a difficult relationship. Rather, the term is commonly used to describe a powerful emotional attachment that may develop within relationships characterized by repeated cycles of affection, emotional pain, reconciliation, and renewed attachment. The relationship itself becomes psychologically confusing because the same person who provides comfort after emotional injury is also the person associated with the injury. The nervous system begins organizing itself around alternating experiences of distress and relief, creating an attachment that can become extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Although the term trauma bond is widely used in clinical discussions and educational literature, it is best understood as a descriptive framework rather than a formal psychiatric diagnosis. To understand why these bonds become so powerful, we need to return to a concept introduced earlier: intermittent reinforcement. Behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner demonstrated decades ago that behaviors reinforced unpredictably are often more resistant to extinction than behaviors reinforced consistently. While human relationships are far more complex than laboratory models, the underlying principle offers important insight. When affection, reassurance, validation, apologies, intimacy, or hope are delivered inconsistently rather than predictably, the nervous system often becomes increasingly focused on obtaining the next positive experience. The uncertainty itself begins strengthening emotional investment. The individual is no longer responding only to the relationship as it exists today. They are continually searching for evidence that the loving, attentive, emotionally available version of the relationship has returned. This is one reason emotionally unhealthy relationships often become increasingly difficult to understand from the outside. Friends typically witness the arguments, the betrayals, the emotional injuries, or the broken promises. They understandably conclude that leaving should be obvious. The individual inside the relationship, however, is remembering something very different. They remember the beginning. They remember the extraordinary affection, the laughter, the dreams they created together, the future they imagined, and the moments that convinced them they had finally found the person they wanted to spend their life with. Those memories are not imaginary. They are real experiences that became deeply encoded within the brain's attachment system. Consequently, the person is often comparing today's painful reality not to an objectively healthy relationship, but to the relationship they once believed they had and continue hoping might return. Hope is one of the most powerful psychological forces we possess. Under healthy circumstances, hope allows people to persevere through adversity, recover from illness, rebuild after loss, and continue investing in meaningful relationships despite inevitable conflict. Hope becomes psychologically complicated, however, when it repeatedly attaches itself to promises of future change that are not consistently supported by sustained behavioral change. The individual begins living emotionally in two different realities at once. One reality reflects what the relationship currently is. The other reflects what the relationship could become if this apology is genuine, if this promise is different, if this treatment program works, if this time really is the turning point. Therapists frequently encounter clients who are not remaining because they enjoy the relationship they currently have. They are remaining because they continue believing in the relationship they once experienced or still hope to experience again. This distinction becomes particularly important when we examine Jack's and Brittany's public relationship. Across multiple seasons, viewers observed repeated cycles that included relational injury, public remorse, reconciliation, renewed commitment, and subsequent disappointment. Whether discussing infidelity, conflict, broken trust, or later relational struggles, the sequence itself became increasingly familiar. It is not my role to determine anyone's motivations or to assign clinical labels from afar. What is psychologically noteworthy is the recurring interpersonal process. Moments of closeness were followed by rupture. Rupture was followed by apology. Apology was followed by renewed hope. Hope was followed by reinvestment. Over time, that sequence became one of the defining emotional rhythms of the relationship. From a behavioral perspective, each reconciliation also reinforced the belief that meaningful change might finally be occurring. Another important psychological concept that helps explain this process is cognitive dissonance, first described by social psychologist Leon Festinger. Cognitive dissonance refers to the psychological discomfort that arises when two deeply held beliefs conflict with one another. Imagine believing, "This person loves me deeply," while simultaneously experiencing repeated behaviors that feel hurtful or inconsistent with love. Holding both realities at the same time creates considerable emotional tension. Rather than immediately abandoning the relationship, many people naturally attempt to reduce that discomfort by searching for explanations that allow both beliefs to coexist. They may tell themselves that their partner is under extraordinary stress, struggling with unresolved trauma, frightened of intimacy, overwhelmed by work, or genuinely trying to change. Sometimes those explanations are entirely accurate. Sometimes they are not. The important point is that the human mind naturally seeks coherence. We prefer narratives that allow us to preserve both our emotional investment and our hope whenever possible. Children further complicate this emotional landscape. Once a couple shares a child, decisions are rarely experienced as affecting only two adults. Parents often begin considering how separation may influence stability, attachment, finances, routines, extended family relationships, holidays, schools, and the developmental experiences of their child. These concerns are real, understandable, and often deeply loving. At the same time, they can make already difficult decisions feel exponentially more complex. Individuals are no longer asking only, "What is best for me?" They are also asking, "What is best for my child?" Those questions do not always produce easy or immediate answers, particularly when hope for change remains emotionally alive. As therapists, we therefore approach these situations with considerable humility. It is easy to understand a relationship once we know how the story ends. It is much more difficult to appreciate the uncertainty experienced while the story is still unfolding. Every decision occurs within the information, emotional resources, attachment history, and psychological realities available at that particular moment in time. That perspective does not remove accountability for harmful behavior. It simply acknowledges that relationships unfold gradually, Attachment develops gradually, and leaving often requires grieving not only the relationship that existed, but also the future someone sincerely believed they were building. Understanding these processes also prepares us to examine another recurring interpersonal pattern frequently discussed within relationships marked by chronic conflict: gaslighting, projection, DARVO, and the psychological processes that can gradually cause individuals to question their own perceptions, memories, and emotional reality. Those concepts have become enormously popular in recent years, yet they are also among the most misunderstood. Before applying them to any public relationship, it is essential that we define them carefully and distinguish evidence-based psychological concepts from the ways these terms are often used casually in everyday conversation. Gaslighting, projection, DARVO, and why people begin. Questioning their own reality. Few psychological concepts have become more widely discussed over the past decade than gaslighting. Like many psychological terms that enter popular culture, its increased visibility has helped many people find language for experiences they previously struggled to describe. At the same time, the term has become so broadly applied that it is sometimes used to describe ordinary disagreements, differences in memory, or any situation in which two people recall an event differently. Clinical psychology requires a much more careful definition because not every disagreement is gaslighting, not every lie constitutes gaslighting, and not every emotionally unhealthy relationship involves gaslighting. Precision matters because when we use psychological language too broadly, we risk overlooking the specific interpersonal processes that make these dynamics so psychologically damaging. The term gaslighting originated from the 1938 stage play Gaslight and the subsequent 1944 film adaptation, in which a husband deliberately manipulates his wife into questioning her own perception of reality by subtly altering her environment while repeatedly insisting that her observations are incorrect. Today, psychologists generally use the term to describe repeated interpersonal behaviors that gradually cause another person to doubt the accuracy of their own memories, perceptions, judgments, or emotional experiences. The goal is not simply to win an argument. The psychological consequence is much deeper. Over time, the individual may begin trusting the other person's interpretation of reality more than their own internal experience. That erosion of self-trust can become one of the most damaging aspects of emotionally unhealthy relationships, because confidence in one's own perception is foundational to psychological well-being. One of the reasons gaslighting is so psychologically powerful is that it rarely begins with obvious distortions of reality. It often begins with small moments that appear entirely explainable. Someone says, "You're overreacting." Another disagreement ends with, "That never happened." A partner insists, "You're too sensitive," or "You're remembering it wrong." Individually, any one of these statements could occur in an ordinary conflict. Human memory is imperfect, and people genuinely remember events differently. Clinicians therefore avoid labeling isolated incidents as gaslighting. Instead, we examine whether a consistent pattern develops in which one person's reality is repeatedly minimized, dismissed, or rewritten until they begin doubting their own perceptions. As this pattern continues, many individuals describe a remarkable psychological shift. They stop asking themselves what they actually think or feel and begin asking what their partner will think about what they think or feel. They mentally rehearse conversations before speaking. They become increasingly cautious about raising concerns because previous attempts have resulted in confusion, defensiveness, or dismissal. Eventually, some individuals report apologizing for emotions they no longer feel confident they are even entitled to have. This represents a significant change in psychological functioning, because healthy relationships generally strengthen a person's trust in their own internal experience rather than weakening it. Another concept that frequently appears in these discussions is projection. Projection was originally described within psychodynamic psychology as a defense mechanism through which individuals attribute thoughts, emotions, motives, or impulses to another person that they have difficulty acknowledging within themselves. Rather than consciously recognizing uncomfortable feelings such as insecurity, shame, anger, jealousy, or guilt, those feelings are experienced as belonging primarily to someone else. Projection is not unique to any particular diagnosis. Most people engage in projection to some degree during periods of heightened stress because defense mechanisms are normal psychological processes. The clinical question is not whether projection ever occurs. The question is whether it becomes a persistent way of avoiding personal responsibility or self-reflection. Closely related to projection is another interpersonal pattern known as DARVO, an acronym developed by psychologist Jennifer Freed that stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. DARVO describes a sequence that sometimes emerges when someone is confronted about behavior another person experiences as harmful. Rather than acknowledging the concern, the individual first denies that the behavior occurred or minimizes its significance. They then shift toward attacking the credibility, motives, or emotional stability of the person raising the concern. Finally, the interpersonal roles become reversed, and the person originally confronted presents themselves as the true victim, while the individual expressing concern is portrayed as the aggressor. Again, this sequence should never be viewed as proof of any particular diagnosis. Instead, it is a descriptive pattern that clinicians sometimes observe across a variety of relational contexts. When viewed individually, projection, gaslighting, or DARVO may appear confusing but relatively manageable. Their cumulative psychological impact, however, can be profound. Relationships function not only through behavior but also through meaning. If someone repeatedly receives the message that their memory cannot be trusted, their emotions are excessive, their concerns are unreasonable, and every attempt to discuss the relationship ultimately becomes evidence that they are the problem, the individual may gradually begin organizing their emotional life around avoiding conflict rather than pursuing authenticity. They stop asking whether something feels healthy and begin asking whether expressing their concerns is even worth the emotional cost. That transition is psychologically significant because it reflects a shift away from secure self-trust and toward chronic self-monitoring. As viewers watched portions of Jack's and Brittany's relationship unfold publicly over many years, many observed conversations in which Brittany appeared to question her own perceptions after being met with denial, minimization, shifting explanations, or repeated assurances that circumstances were different from how she understood them. It is important to emphasize that reality television presents edited footage rather than complete interpersonal histories, and no responsible clinician can determine another person's internal motivations from edited programming alone. Nevertheless, the observable communication patterns provide valuable educational opportunities because they allow us to discuss the psychology of these interpersonal processes without pretending to know everything occurring behind the scenes. The purpose of this case study is not to establish certainty regarding another person's intentions. The purpose is to help listeners recognize relational dynamics that may also appear within their own lives. Perhaps one of the most important lessons emerging from these concepts is that emotionally unhealthy relationships rarely dismantle confidence all at once. More often, confidence is eroded gradually through hundreds of ordinary interactions that each appear relatively insignificant on their own. A dismissed concern, a denied conversation, a criticism framed as honesty, a promise followed by disappointment, an apology followed by repetition, a loving weekend followed by another emotional injury. Over months and years, those experiences accumulate until the individual begins wondering not only whether the relationship is healthy, but whether they can trust themselves to accurately evaluate the relationship at all. When someone reaches that point, The central psychological task often becomes much larger than deciding whether to stay or leave. It becomes rebuilding confidence in their own perception, judgment, and inner experience. This brings us to one of the most hopeful chapters in Brittany's public story. As we move beyond the marriage and into separation, co-parenting, and the decisions she has made regarding her own health, body, and future, we begin observing something equally important from a psychological perspective. We begin observing the gradual process of reclaiming identity. In Bowen Family Systems Theory, this developmental process is closely related to differentiation of self, the ability to remain emotionally connected to others while becoming increasingly grounded in one's own values, beliefs, boundaries, and sense of self. That journey, rather than the breakup itself, may ultimately become the most psychologically significant chapter of Brittany Cartwright's story. Differentiation of self, reclaiming an identity after an emotionally unhealthy relationship. One of the most hopeful observations in all of psychology is that people are remarkably capable of change. Although early attachment experiences, family systems, and unhealthy relationship patterns may influence us profoundly, they do not permanently determine who we become. Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity for growth throughout the lifespan. Modern neuroscience refers to this capacity as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself through new experiences, repeated learning, emotionally corrective relationships, and intentional behavioral change. Bowen Family Systems Theory describes a remarkably similar developmental process using different language. Bowen called it differentiation of self, and I believe it is one of the most important psychological concepts we can understand when examining Brittany Cartwright's public story. Differentiation of self refers to the ability to remain emotionally connected to other people without losing your own identity in the process. Healthy differentiation does not mean becoming emotionally detached, cold, or independent to the point that relationships no longer matter. It means developing the capacity to think clearly while emotions are running high, to establish boundaries without becoming consumed by guilt, to tolerate another person's disappointment without immediately abandoning your own needs, and to remain connected without allowing someone else's emotional state to completely determine your own. Differentiation asks a deceptively simple question that often requires years of personal growth to answer. Can I remain myself while staying connected to someone I love? Many people enter adulthood believing that love requires self-sacrifice. They learn, often without realizing it, that maintaining peace means accommodating another person's emotional needs before acknowledging their own. They become extraordinarily skilled at reading the emotional temperature of a room, anticipating conflict before it occurs, avoiding difficult conversations, and making themselves increasingly flexible in order to preserve connection. Those strategies are often remarkably adaptive during childhood because they help maintain attachment to important caregivers. The difficulty arises when those same developmental adaptations continue organizing adult romantic relationships. Gradually, the individual stops asking, "What do I need?" and begins asking, "What will keep this relationship emotionally stable?" Although that shift may appear loving from the outside, it frequently represents a gradual loss of differentiation. One of the reasons separation is so psychologically disorienting is that it often requires rebuilding an identity that has slowly become intertwined with another person's emotional world. People frequently describe feeling as though they no longer recognize themselves after leaving a long-term relationship. They wonder where their confidence went. They question why decisions suddenly feel so difficult. They notice that simple choices now require reassurance from others because they have spent years organizing their thinking around another person's reactions rather than their own internal values. Therapists hear this repeatedly from clients. They are not simply grieving the loss of a partner. They are grieving the version of themselves that slowly disappeared while attempting to preserve the relationship. From a Bowen Family Systems perspective, One of the most significant developmental tasks following separation involves learning to distinguish thinking from feeling. Bowen never suggested that emotions were unimportant. Rather, he observed that highly anxious emotional systems often make it extraordinarily difficult to think clearly. When anxiety becomes overwhelming, the nervous system naturally prioritizes immediate emotional relief over long-term problem solving. Individuals may react impulsively, avoid difficult conversations, repeatedly seek reassurance, or organize their lives around reducing another person's emotional distress. Differentiation allows people to experience powerful emotions while continuing to make decisions that remain consistent with their long-term values rather than their immediate anxiety. As Brittany's public story has continued beyond the marriage, many viewers have observed a woman who appears increasingly willing to speak openly about experiences that she once seemed hesitant to discuss. Again, it is impossible to know another person's internal emotional process from television or interviews alone, and I want to be very careful not to overinterpret what we observe publicly. Nevertheless, from an educational perspective, it provides an opportunity to discuss an important psychological phenomenon. Individuals frequently become more capable of identifying unhealthy relational patterns only after they have gained sufficient emotional distance from the relationship itself. While living inside an emotionally intense relationship, the nervous system is often organized around surviving the next interaction, repairing the most recent conflict, or preserving hope for future change. After separation, cognitive resources gradually become available for reflection rather than constant emotional management. That increased psychological distance often allows people to recognize patterns that were extraordinarily difficult to see while they were actively living them. One example that I find particularly meaningful involves Brittany's decision to undergo surgery to remove the breast implants that had been placed years earlier and to reduce the size of her breasts. Publicly, she has described physical discomfort as well as a desire to feel more like herself again. Every woman's decision regarding cosmetic surgery is deeply personal, and no one outside that individual can fully understand all of the factors involved. From a psychological perspective, however, the timing is noteworthy because identity reconstruction frequently involves reclaiming aspects of the self that gradually became organized around another person's preferences rather than one's own. Whether the decision involves appearance, career, friendships, hobbies, clothing, or personal values, many individuals leaving emotionally unhealthy relationships begin asking a profoundly important question: what do I actually want now that I am making this decision for myself? That question represents one of the clearest expressions of differentiation. Another important aspect of differentiation involves redefining one's relationship with conflict itself. Individuals emerging from chronically unpredictable relationships often discover that they remain hypervigilant even in emotionally safe environments. Their nervous system has learned to anticipate criticism, disappointment, or emotional escalation because those experiences became repeatedly associated with intimate relationships. Contemporary neuroscience describes this process through the brain's predictive coding systems. The brain continually generates predictions about what is likely to happen next, based upon repeated past experience. If conflict has repeatedly been followed by criticism, betrayal, or emotional instability, the nervous system naturally begins preparing for those outcomes before they occur. Healing, therefore, involves more than simply leaving the relationship. It also requires helping the nervous system learn through repeated corrective experiences that closeness no longer has to feel psychologically dangerous. Perhaps this is where Brittany's story becomes most universally relevant. Whether someone has experienced divorce, an emotionally unhealthy dating relationship, a difficult parent-child relationship, or even a painful friendship, the developmental task remains remarkably similar. We eventually reach a point where we must decide whether we will continue organizing our lives around another person's expectations, or whether we will begin making decisions that are increasingly consistent with our own values, identity, and long-term well-being. Differentiation does not eliminate grief. It does not erase love. It does not require bitterness or resentment. Rather, it allows people to carry compassion for another person's humanity, while simultaneously acknowledging that compassion does not require abandoning themselves. This observation leads naturally into one final question that extends far beyond Jax Taylor and Brittany Cartwright. If unhealthy relational patterns often develop gradually, if attachment makes leaving extraordinarily difficult, and if differentiation requires years of intentional growth, then how do we protect ourselves and the people we love from repeating those same patterns in future relationships? That question brings us to the final chapter of today's case study, where we will examine the lessons this relationship offers every parent, every couple, every therapist, and every individual hoping to build healthier relationships in the future. What this relationship can teach every one of us, one of the reasons I wanted to dedicate an entire episode to the relationship between Jax Taylor and Brittany Cartwright, is because I believe many people misunderstand the purpose of psychology. The goal of psychology is not to determine whether someone is a good person or a bad person. It is not to diagnose strangers from television. It is not to create heroes and villains. Human relationships are almost always more complex than that. The purpose of psychology is to help us understand the emotional processes that shape behavior, because once we understand those processes, we become better equipped to recognize similar patterns within our own lives. Every relationship we observe becomes an opportunity to ask deeper questions about attachment, communication, boundaries, emotional regulation, accountability, resilience, and growth. That is why I often say that reality television is no longer simply entertainment once you begin watching it through the eyes of a therapist. It becomes a living classroom where family systems, developmental psychology, neuroscience, and attachment theory unfold in front of us over many years. Perhaps the most important lesson emerging from today's discussion is that emotionally unhealthy relationships almost never begin looking emotionally unhealthy. They usually begin with hope. They begin with excitement. They begin with laughter, chemistry, affection, dreams about the future, and the deeply human desire to love and be loved. This reality is important because many people continue asking themselves, how could someone so intelligent not have seen the warning signs? That question assumes the warning signs were obvious from the beginning. More often, they were not. Relationships develop gradually. Attachment develops gradually. Trust develops gradually. Emotional investment develops gradually. Likewise, criticism, control, inconsistency, emotional unpredictability, and the erosion of self-confidence often develop gradually as well. The nervous system adapts one experience at a time, making it remarkably difficult to appreciate the larger pattern while living inside it. Another lesson involves the extraordinary influence of patterns over promises. Throughout this episode, we have returned repeatedly to the same psychological principle because it may be one of the most valuable concepts listeners can carry into their own relationships. Healthy relationships are not defined by beautiful apologies. They are not defined by extraordinary declarations of love, dramatic gestures, or convincing explanations after conflict. Healthy relationships are defined by consistent behavior across time. Accountability is meaningful only when it is followed by sustained behavioral change. Insight is meaningful only when it becomes action. Promises become psychologically significant only when they are repeatedly supported by observable consistency. Every relationship experiences conflict. Every relationship experiences disappointment. What distinguishes healthy relationships is not the absence of rupture, but the presence of reliable repair, personal responsibility, emotional safety, and enduring change. Today's case study also reminds us that attachment is one of the most powerful organizing forces in human development. We are biologically wired to seek connection because, throughout human history, connection increased the likelihood of survival. Consequently, our nervous systems are remarkably reluctant to abandon important attachment relationships, even when those relationships become painful. Understanding this biological reality helps us replace judgment with compassion. Rather than asking why someone stayed, we begin asking what emotional needs the relationship had come to fulfill. Was it providing identity, belonging, hope, family, stability, a vision of the future? Understanding attachment does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does help explain why leaving often requires grieving far more than the relationship itself. Individuals frequently grieve the future they imagined, the family they hoped to build, the promises they believed, and the version of themselves they expected to become. There is another lesson that I believe deserves equal attention, particularly for parents listening today. Whether your children are 5 years old or 35 years old, they are watching relationships far more carefully than we often realize. Children learn what love looks like by observing how adults speak to one another. They learn how conflict is handled. They learn whether apologies are followed by changed behavior. They learn whether boundaries are respected, whether criticism becomes normalized, whether affection feels emotionally safe, and whether love requires abandoning oneself to preserve peace. These observations gradually become part of their internal working models, the relational blueprints they will eventually carry into adulthood. One of the greatest gifts parents can give their children is not perfection. It is allowing them to repeatedly witness relationships characterized by respect, repair, accountability, curiosity, emotional safety, and mutual dignity. If there is one concept I hope you remember after today's episode, it is this: relationships should allow you to become more fully yourself, not less. Healthy love expands identity. It encourages growth. It creates emotional safety for vulnerability. It respects individuality while strengthening connection. It allows both people to disagree without fearing abandonment. It allows both people to maintain friendships, interests, careers, and identities outside the relationship because secure attachment is strengthened by autonomy, not threatened by it. If you find yourself becoming progressively smaller, quieter, more anxious, increasingly responsible for another person's emotions, or increasingly uncertain of your own perceptions, those experiences deserve thoughtful reflection. They do not automatically define the relationship, but they are important data points that should never be ignored. Finally, I want to return to where we began. Throughout this episode, we have discussed love bombing, attachment, intermittent reinforcement, trauma bonding, objectification, psychological ownership, body image, postpartum identity, gaslighting, projection, DARVO, differentiation of self, and Bowen Family Systems Theory. Those are important psychological concepts, but they are not the destination. They are simply tools. The destination has always been greater self-awareness. Every case study I present is ultimately an invitation to look inward rather than outward. If today's episode only changes the way you think about Jax Taylor and Brittany Cartwright, then I have probably fallen short of my goal. If, however, today's discussion helps you better understand your own relationships, recognize patterns that previously felt invisible, communicate with greater clarity, establish healthier boundaries, or respond with greater compassion toward yourself or someone you love, then these conversations have served their purpose. Because the psychology I break down doesn't excuse the behavior. Hopefully, the psychology explains the behavior. And my hope is that by understanding someone else's story, you begin to better understand your own story, your loved one's story, or the story of someone else in your life. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. If today's conversation helped you better understand attachment, family systems, or emotionally unhealthy relationship patterns, I hope you'll share this episode with someone who may benefit from it. These conversations are designed to create understanding, reduce shame, and provide practical psychological tools that listeners can apply in their own lives. If you're enjoying the Reality Case Studies series, be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss a future episode. You can also find companion articles, newsletters, educational resources, and additional episodes on my website, The Path to Peace Therapy, where I continue exploring ADHD, OCD, family systems, parenting, relationships, executive functioning, and integrative mental health through the lens of both clinical research and real-life application. Until next time, remember that healing rarely begins with finding the perfect answer. More often, it begins by learning to ask a better question. Stop asking, who was right? And begin asking, what pattern has developed? How did it develop? And what might that pattern be trying to teach me? When we learn to see patterns rather than isolated moments, we don't just become better observers of other people's lives. We become more intentional participants in our own. I'm Stephanie Buckley, and I'll see you next time on the Path to Peace Therapy podcast.